Coming up on Maine Challenge, economics and racial inequality. Hello, and welcome to Maine Challenge, a production of Lincoln County Indivisible and Lincoln County Television. I'm Mike Hers. I'm sitting in for Chuck Kruger, who is our regular host, who will be back next week. And we're delighted to have with us this morning Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, who represents the Bayside and Parkside districts of Portland, who just has been reelected to her third term in the legislature. She's the first African-American woman elected to the Maine House. And we have with us also Garrett Martin, who is the Executive Director of the Maine Center for Economic Policy. He's an expert on Maine's economy, and his organization is a research and policy organization dedicated to improving the economic well-being of moderate and low-income Mainers. Rachel, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and the projects that you're working on currently?
Yeah, sure. Good morning. Thank you, Mike, for having me, and hello to Garrett.
Hey there.
Yeah, hey, how you doing? Thank you for having me here with you today. My name is Rachel Talbot Ross. I am proudly a ninth generation African-American Mainer. I grew up in Maine, born in Portland, and I proudly represent part of Portland, as you noted. I have spent most of my life growing up within the civil rights movement here in Maine and working on issues of systemic racism. I serve in the 128th legislature on the Judiciary Committee and Health and Human Services. Prior to that, I served on the Criminal Justice Committee. I'm very, very proud of over 20 years of volunteerism and service in the community, particularly focused on abolition of prisons and prison reform, voting rights, and really bringing an anti-Black lens to public policy.
And I think one other thing, if I can add, I believe that Representative Talbot Ross, your father was the first African-American elected to the Maine legislature, is that correct?
He was. Thank you for mentioning him. Gerald Talbot, my father, 45 years before I got elected, he was the first African-American to be elected to the Maine state legislature.
In 9 generations.
But that was pretty recent by Maine history. I mean, that to have no representation from the Black community until, what year was it, 60s?
Well, my father was elected in 1972. He served 3 terms, and then 45 years later, so I was elected as the first African-American woman. It took 45 years.
And Garrett is the Executive Director of MECEP, the Maine Center for Economic Policy. He knows more about the economy than practically anybody else in Maine. Tell us a little bit about why you're interested in Black racism and what MECEP is doing in relation to this issue.
Sure, Mike. You know, I have to say, I think there are plenty of people who know plenty about the economy in Maine because they're experiencing it firsthand, unfortunately. But, you know, I come to this work in part from a background. I'm a generation removed from poverty. My dad was, one of these kids who grew up poor in the rural South, and he managed to make it out. And I grew up in southwestern Virginia. Actually worked in the Mississippi Delta for 5 years before moving to Maine on promoting access to home ownership and business development services for primarily Black-owned businesses. And certainly through that work and other life experiences, became acutely aware of some of the realities, while not my lived experience, certainly the reality that in this country, it's undeniable that our legacy of slavery and the history that has propagated in terms of some of the laws on the books and systemic biases that exist within our policymaking landscape continue to this day. And so as we do our work at the Maine Center for Economic Policy, one of the things that we're very much aware of is when we talk about building an economy that works for all people, that means all people. And when you look at the data, it is very clear that there are disparities that persist to this day. And, one of my favorites, not the right term, but I think, a lot of people like to say, well, if Black folks, for instance, had as much education as white folks, then a lot of these disparities would go away. Well, one thing we know, for instance, from looking at the data is that Black people who have college degrees are just as likely to be unemployed as white people who have high school degrees. And so, that's an example of where there are other reasons and factors and forces at play for why we see some of the disparities that we do. And, Representative Talbot Ross and I had the opportunity to get to know each other early on in my time in Maine, because I think as we started to look at the data, we reached out to her and said, hey, look, for instance, Maine had a couple of years ago one of the highest Black poverty rates in the country. And what's that about? And how do we understand that? And more importantly, how do we take steps to ensure that that's not the status quo that we continue to have in the state? So we're working hard with a number of different organizations and partners and folks like Representative Talbot Ross to really understand not only the nature of these issues, but more importantly, how to move forward and address them from a systemic perspective.
So over the last 2 months, we've been focusing on two serious epidemics in Maine. One is obviously the COVID-19 epidemic, but there has been an epidemic of resurgence of awareness, at least, about Black racism. How are these two related? And talk a little bit about how they're connected.
So, the pandemic of COVID-19 is only a symptom of what we know is true in the United States, which is the pandemic of systemic racism. And so while in the last couple of months, we've been focused on COVID and looking at our public health system, what we know is that racism is a public health crisis. And for us to not see the context of COVID embedded in our history and in all of our policies and experiences that are for people of color in this country would be fairly naive. We are in a twin pandemic of COVID and systemic racism. The public execution of George Floyd seems to have awakened a white majority to the horrors that Black and brown people live through every single day in America. The data, the limited data that we have in Maine is representative of the national data. For some reason, there's not racism in this state because there's quote unquote not enough of them. But we have the data that we do have, and some of it of which Garrett has mentioned, certainly indicates that structural racism is alive and well here in this state. And in fact, we were founded within a racist construction. So they're not separate. You cannot separate systemic racism from any system that we live under. It is embedded in every single area of our social, political, and economic life. There's no debate. And now the question is, since we have white people are, as they say, woke, now that white people are paying attention to this as if it's new news, the question is for all Mainers, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, and Mike, if I can add to that, part of what Representative Talbot Ross knows, certainly we've discussed before, is that in Maine, for instance, when we talk about COVID, Black Mainers are 8 times more likely to be hospitalized than white Mainers. They represent 11% of people in the hospital versus accounting for 1.4% of households. They're 27 times more likely to test positive. And certainly there are those folks who want to say, oh, well, this is because of living conditions or, health issues. Well, how did they get to those health issues or living conditions? Well, or how did they get into an at-risk situation to begin with? And one thing we know, for instance, is that when you look at who the frontline workers are, cleaning up in the healthcare facilities and the hospitals, who are on the front lines of nursing, who are, checkout clerks at your grocery stores, they are disproportionately people of color relative to the white population. So just from that stat alone, you have a population that's already overrepresented in the sort of frontline community. And they are working in occupations that historically have not had the same kinds of protections that workers in other industries have enjoyed, both in terms of wage levels and in terms of the ability to take time off when you're sick, and those kinds of things. And those realities are very much steeped in our racist past. When the labor standards at the national level were enacted generations ago, there was a specific carve out of industries that were disproportionately the workforce were people of color, and that was the way to get Southern lawmakers on board with some of those proposals. So we didn't get here by accident, is the point. And to try and pin some of the outcomes that we see currently on specific individual behavior is just a complete misread and woeful ignorance of our history in this country. And I think, as Representative Talbot Ross alluded to, that certainly the incidents with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many others have brought that into clear relief. But this is more than about a discussion of sort of reforming our criminal justice system. It's really about unpacking how we got into this predicament to begin with.
Which Mainers have always enjoyed this false, sense of equality, because I was taught in all of my curriculum that Maine entered the Union as a free state. So we must be the good folks, right? We must be the good folks. We entered the Union as a free state, which ignores Maine's participation in the slave trade. It ignores what has happened, the American genocide of 1492 and its impact on our tribal populations. But it is a false sense of really of comfort that we somehow here are better than other folks in other states, even though we're the whitest state in the country. We still operate off this kind of false sense of security around, it doesn't apply to us, that we do not have a problem of racism here in the state of Maine. The data that Garrett is mentioning, is alarming, to have the worst outcomes for Black African Americans of COVID in the entire country. But, you just look to our criminal justice system. And while we know that there are similar uses for drugs between Black African Americans and white, Black people still are very disproportionate in our arrest data and in our sentencing. So we don't have to look very far to see that Maine has work to do. And part of that work means naming it, and then doing something about it. So we've got to name it, and then we've got to do something about it.
The two of you are intimately involved in both, the work that you both do in these issues every day. For many of us, it's only the unfortunate incidents of the last couple of months that have made people aware. In our I live in Damarascotta, a little town of 2,000 people. The aftermath of the killings have led to 300 people out in the street protesting in the whitest county, the oldest county in the country. How do we maintain the kind of level of interest in these issues? How do we keep this momentum going? Because it's really important, and it's gotten a lot of people who haven't been involved.
So, Mike, I'll take a crack, Rachel. I first of all, I should acknowledge, I'm your neighbor in Newcastle. I'm proud to count myself and members of my family among those 300 folks. And, you know, the reality is, I think for all of us, this is a journey. You know, there is no end point that we're going to get to where we have quote unquote solved all these issues. And when I think about my own personal journey in this space, you know, I've definitely had moments when I've been called out for sort of instances of not being aware or being biased in a way that wasn't appropriate. But I think what's more important, what I've found very instructive in recent years, is really appreciating a lot of what, you know, Ibrahim Kendi has kind of coined as how to be an anti-racist. I think that is most important, because for so long in this country, and again, as somebody who grew up in the Deep South, you know, you hear people say, "Oh, I'm not a racist." You know, some of my best friends are X, Y, Z, right? And therefore I'm not a racist. And well, you know, that may be well and good for how you feel about yourself, but the reality is it does nothing to understand, appreciate, and address the broader systems and systems changes that are needed to ensure that we truly have a society in which all people have a chance to, you know, succeed. And, you know, the other thing is, where we are is steeped in a deep, long legacy of racist history and past policies. And so, you know, we can talk about income inequality, but start talking about wealth inequality and you got a whole nother game going on. And, you know, there you can't deny sort of what the realities are. So I guess my point here, Mike, is that we all need to figure out, those of us who are white, how to be allies and, you know, good partners in this discussion. But I think most importantly, we all need to really both check ourselves in these things and recognize that there's stuff we're going to get wrong. And hopefully we have the relationships with people who can help us understand where that is. But more importantly, that we can constantly say, okay, how can we ensure that this is not only not racist, but is actually going to improve outcomes for people of color and get us to a closer to the place we think we should be as a society. So, Rachel, I don't know what you.
No, I definitely agree with you, and I would say to those people who are taking to the streets, you know, just keep doing that. You know, stay out there, be visible, make your voice heard. We need you to keep rallying and keep protesting and keep marching, but we also need you to do something much more impactful in terms of policy, and that is, you know, to follow the movement for Black Lives, you know, to look at what some of those demands are and to be able to allow, and I would say actually ensure that people of color, Black and brown people, are part of your decision-making tables, that, you know, we are not tangent, we're not your project to save. We're not the flavor of the moment. We've been here longer than you have. And so it is time for, yes, keep up the marching. Absolutely. Keep that going, keep that energy going. But now what you need to do is you got to go to the maine.gov and you got to sign up, you know, for notices when our state legislative committees are meeting, and see what they're meeting about. Look at what those policies are they're getting ready to debate. And ensure that the folks who are representing you know that they need to make racial equity part of, you know, their deliberations, that the bills that they write, they need to make sure that there is a specific strategy to address the racial disparities. Get engaged at that level. There are too many people in Maine who have no idea who their city councilor is. They don't know who their state legislator is. And it's time for us, actually, I mean, the easiest thing is to change those demographics to make sure that people of color are being elected to those positions, but also to make sure that any decision-making table that exists within your sphere of influence, that you are able to give that seat up and or ensure that that debate, that deliberation, whatever's happening in the public square, has the voice and the lived experience to inform that idea, that issue, and making sure that the folks who are most impacted, their voice is what's leading moving forward. Until we do that, I work in Augusta, Garrett, you're in Augusta. Until we do that, the same exact privileged white establishment is going to dictate all of our policies and all of the ways in which we live our lives. And I've got to say, no matter if it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, it does not matter. Those disparities are generational. They are generational. We've not moved. It doesn't matter about the political party. We have not moved. So to those people in these small towns, stick to the streets, but you've got to get more involved in what's happening at the policy level in Augusta, and I dare say in Washington.
And Mike, I would add one other quick thing, which is I do, again, both my kids were born in Jackson, Mississippi. We live in Newcastle. We are, as you pointed out, a very white county. And so I think one of our challenges is figuring out how we get perspective, as Representative Talbot Ross indicated. And so, for folks who haven't, for instance, gone on the Black Lives Matter site and checked out their agenda, that's something. The great thing about social media is you can find things that affirm your view, or you can find things that challenge your view. And I would encourage folks to look for news sources, media sources that offer a perspective from, people of color. There's a great site, Color Lines. I think it's a .com. But, all the people who write for them are people of color. I often find when I go there, there are perspectives that I just don't think about as a white guy, right? Like, it's just not my general modus operandi. It's like, oh, I get it now. And so I think we all have to do the work ourselves, but as Representative Talbot Ross said, at the end of the day, unless we are pressing our leaders to be more intentional in how they're engaging this, we're not going to get there unless we're impressing, established party groups to think about how they're identifying, recruiting, nominating candidates, and vetting them. We're not going to get there. So those are some local kind of actions that can make a difference at a broader level.
And
go ahead.
I would add two other things. I mean, it's not, rocket science at this point. Go to Movement for Black Lives. Black and brown people are telling you, here's the roadmap. This is what needs to happen. So we don't have to really debate it too much. We need to fund resources at the local level. We need to build the infrastructure in these communities so that they are self-determinant. We need to fund and invest in, making sure that we have the data. One of the things Garrett can tell you quite unequivocally is that we do not collect data. There is no mandate in the state to collect data based on race. And so while we do have some good data, the wealth gap, obviously the wage gap, we've got criminal justice data, we've got some education data, it's not great data. We're not using the data to inform the policies. We're not using the data to shape our discourse. We're not using any of the data that we have right now. And so go to Movement for Black Lives. It's not that difficult if folks want to know what to do. You'll hear a lot about defunding the police. I absolutely believe that we have to take and divest money out of the structures, the punitive structures that have disproportionately impacted brown and black people, and invest that money in the opportunity and the prosperity and the hope of these communities. But it's not that difficult, Mike. It really isn't. We know what we need to do. What the challenge for us here in Maine is the political will to do it, is to make sure we elect people who have the political will to do it, and to don't take anything else for an answer. We must confront systemic racism now.
One of the things that makes me feel encouraged is the involvement of youth, the Sunrise Movement, the number of kids who are on the streets, the number of kids who are aware of these issues. Garrett, your kids who were born in the South, I think probably have a great advantage because they saw, well, you got out of there before they were old enough to appreciate things, but I think they still must realize how important their view is.
Well, to that point, Mike, my son and I were down in Georgia for the election, the last gubernatorial election, and for him, it was truly eye-opening. I mean, the polling station that we were based at was one of the polling stations where they didn't have enough power cords for all the voting machines, and so they got a 3-hour line. And meanwhile, the local sheriff decided to show up and idle his car for 45 minutes outside while we were waiting. Well, there's some real historic significance to those actions. And so they, and I think that it's easy being here to not understand those moments and those sort of many aggressions that people face. But I would agree with you. I think my observation of young people is that they are a little more in tune with this. And yet at the same time, quite honestly, as someone who works with young people in this area, I can also see how some young people, because they don't actually have relationships with people of color, find themselves easily slipping into worldviews and belief systems that are extremely detrimental to this notion of building an anti-racist society. So there's a balance there, but I think on net, you're right. I think there's a greater awareness. I think, there's greater presence of people of color at a sort of global level, but we still have a long way to go. I mean, the fact that we have 2 lawmakers of color in the Maine state legislature, the Black Caucus is Representative Talbot Ross. We have 50% of the Black Caucus here, and Representative Craig Hickman. And I can tell you, their voices have made a tremendous difference, but we need more voices in that mix. And it's not that we don't want for the people who are qualified and can do those jobs. It's that we haven't sort of challenged ourselves to figure out how to create the pathways and open the door and step aside so that those people can come to the fore. And some of them are. There are some great young leaders around the state who are people of color, and I can't wait to see them sort of take the reins.
Thanks. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Rachel Talbot Ross and Garrett Martin, for joining us. This has been a great show, and we've only scratched the surface. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike.
We'll come back anytime. Thank you.
Thank you. We recently lost John Lewis, a member of Congress, an iconic member of Congress, who is a moral leader of the sort we've never had before. We're very fortunate this morning to have with us Shelley Pingree, our own congressman, who will give us a tribute to John Lewis.
Passing of John Lewis has been so sad for all of us, and I just learned so much from him. So much about the South, about civil rights, about the history of our country, and in Congress itself. I was there the day he said, after the tragic shooting in Orlando, and we were so frustrated that we couldn't move forward on gun legislation, and the Republicans wouldn't take up a bill when we were in the minority. And he just said, well, we got to sit down. And sitting down on the well of the House for 27 hours, listening to his stories, listening to people talk about their own personal stories around gun violence, from all places in the country and all colors and all, backgrounds. Everybody had a story, and he was right there. And we'll just always, see him saying those words. You got to get in trouble, you got to make good trouble, got to stand up for what's right, what you believe in, what you know is right. It doesn't matter how many times he said it, how many times I heard him say it. It just meant so much every time. And maybe the most important thing about knowing John was that as a colleague, you could be in a crowded room, pre-COVID crowded room, on the House floor, and when you walk by him or had a question for him, he'd always start by saying, how are you doing? How are you today? What's going on with you? And here you are talking to this senior member of the House, icon, legend of the civil rights movement, and he always had time for everybody else. He was always kind, never acted like he was too important to talk to anybody. If it was my grandson visiting, asking him to sign the comic book or take a picture, I often had visitors who would say, is there any chance we could meet John Lewis? And he would come out in the hallway and say hello to my friends or visitors from Maine and take a picture and, act like there was nowhere else he needed to be. So we've been so blessed as a country to have him in our presence. It's been amazing that he was a member of Congress for so long and was behind so many important things that have been done in this country, and just is a true inspiration to all of us. We need him now more than ever, but I think we're all going to double down and do what we know is right in the memory of John Lewis.